Brother Bernard here is going to teach today. So give him your full attention, and I promise you'll learn something.
All right. We're live? It's working? Okay. We're ready to go. All right. How many of you are senior pastors thinking of starting a work, a daughter work? Anybody in that category? Okay. And how many of you are looking to start a work yourself, whether as a church plant or a daughter work? Okay. So I've got some notes here. If you'd like to go through where we were, let me make sure I see. We're going to try to go, on the schedule it says to 10:20, so we're going to probably go to 10:25, and then we'll still have 15 minutes for small group interaction. What we've done yesterday is we ended up having questions, so I'm happy to use that extra time for questions or use that time for if you want to break up into several groups. But let me just show you where we are. If you're looking at my notes, in yesterday's sessions, if you start, my notes begin on page 18. So essentially, yesterday we covered the notes for daughter work pastors on page 18, and we covered the notes on page 22, planting daughter churches. And so now on page 24, I have a section called Planting Daughter Works Within Cultural or Minority Groups. So I want to talk more about this. And of course, some of these principles will apply to any church planting from any perspective. But I want to bring a focus on how do you reach people with a different ethnicity or language or minority group. And of course, this can apply if you are trying to plant a daughter work specifically within a cultural group, or even if you are trying to increase the diversity of your own congregation. So I'll try to speak so it's, even though it's titled this way, I'll try to speak so it applies to everyone in the room. So I hope that's something that you're interested in. Now, I don't claim to be an expert. I'm one of those people that's an old white guy, which is and male and heterosexual. So I'm probably the least politically correct minority in America right now, but apparently the most powerful minority in America right now. So we're going to cut through the political correctness. I was raised in Korea, which gives me a different perspective. At the time I lived there, it was a very poor third world country. And although as an American I was a favored person, considered wealthy in that culture, still I can tell you many experiences that I was the only white person in the entire building or the entire bus, or I can tell you stories of walking home from school with my little sister and being followed by 50 Korean kids trying to see the white person. And then sometimes not turning out so pleasant, being snowballs and rocks coming my way. And so I can, I know what it's like to be singled out inevitably by looking different from everybody around you, and I know what it's like to be despised in some cases or picked on because of being a different minority. So I can sympathize a little bit with people who walk into a church and they look different than everybody in the church, or they feel that they're singled out even in society. And so I wrote these notes in 2009, which was my last year as pastor before I became general superintendent. So I gave you some statistics at what our district was at that time, and then even what our church was. And you might be interested to see, at that time our church was 51% white Anglo. I use that term because our biggest minority was Hispanic. 26% Hispanic, 17% black or African American, 6% Asian. And that diversity was actually a little bit bigger or a little bit more than the metropolitan area, which I gave you those statistics as well. And we started a number of daughter works within different minority groups, and we had regular attendees from about 30 different nations at any given time. So it didn't start that way. It started when we started the church. mainly we were attracting mostly white people. Our very first convert was an African American lady, but her brother immediately began working on her, saying, why would you go to the white man's church? Why would you pay tithes to the white man? And that was a big issue for her. So what I did find is that even though we could win people from minority groups, it's a challenge because you naturally tend to attract people that are more like you. And so if there is someone who comes who's of a minority and they look around and they're the only one, or even if there's several people in the congregation but there's nobody in leadership, then they don't tend to stick. And so it's kind of a catch-22 because you win some converts, they're not immediately ready for leadership, so you can't just promote them as tokenism or quotas or affirmative action. But at the same time, if visitors come or even converts come and they don't get the sense that they could one day be in leadership, then they're not highly motivated to come back. So what we would find, we'd win people and then lose people, win people and lose people. And in our area, it seemed the Hispanics were more willing to stick because they were maybe more easily assimilated to the main culture of the area and of the church. But other minorities were very sensitive to the fact were there people like them. So how do you change that? How do you do better than that? And I think, first of all, you have to have a burden. You have to have a desire to do this. And so let's say you're a senior pastor and you would like to increase the diversity of your congregation. Or let's say you see an opportunity among the immigrant community or minority community to plant a church. How do you do that? And let me just say this. When we establish churches, we don't establish black churches, white churches, Spanish churches. We just establish churches. Everybody's welcome. But let's be very honest. When you're facing a language issue, well, then it does make sense to target on the basis of language, not race. Likewise, our patterns of our demographics in our communities can be highly segregated. Maybe not intentionally, but in other words, there are areas of a city or that have a very high proportion of minorities. So if your church doesn't happen to be in that area, there's a lot of people you may never reach. If you intentionally plant a church in that area, you're very likely to reach a very high percentage of those minorities. So we would never want to identify a church as limited or defined by race, but you are going to find that when you can intentionally plant churches in communities that are going to be effective in reaching those communities. For example, the African American community. And a lot of times, there are distinct cultural differences and even church culture that people feel more comfortable in a place where they're in the majority. So what I try to do as a pastor is cast the vision not of either or, but both and. We're going to try to grow our church as big as we can, be as diverse as we can. And so we're not going to say, oh, well, they can go to another church where they're more comfortable. No. They need to be comfortable in our church. At the same time, realistically, we can't say, well, we've done our job. We welcome everybody, and so if they've got a problem with that, too bad for them. No, they're sinners. They may have a problem with a white pastor or the idea of coming to a majority white church. I can't convert them before they're converted. So it's a both-and strategy. In other words, what I'm saying is I will intentionally try to raise up people of minorities who become leaders and pastors. I will try to help them in their ministry if they feel led to plant a church and want to do so to reach their community. We will try to find a location that is effective in that. And so, for example, we did start a Daughterworks in a predominantly African-American area of our city, and we started with an African-American pastor. And I told him up front, I said, look, I want you to reach everybody you can. If a white person walks in your doors, Hispanic person, you reach them just like anybody else. Don't send them to me. But if for some reason they express that they're looking for a church that would reflect more of their background, then talk to me and we'll try to work it out. Same way. I have African American people come to our church, get saved. I'm going to try to keep them as much as possible. If for some reason they live near you or they express a desire, maybe their family is not comfortable coming to church or whatever, then I'll call you and we'll talk about how can we help them. But we're not going to split up according to race. We're going to try to reach whomever God lets us reach, facing the reality that we can be more effective in certain demographics and communities than others. So to me, it's a both-and strategy, that we need to create as much diversity as possible within our church. At the same time, we need to raise up leaders who are minorities. We need to try to support Daughterworks in minority communities and partner with other pastors who are minorities. And that's one thing we can do. If you're a white pastor, if you can identify black, Hispanic, Asian, whatever pastor in your area that's already got started, come alongside and help them, befriend them, have fellowship between your churches, because it's a both-and strategy. Now, how does this happen? The first thing is you've got to have a burden. You have to have a desire to do this, to go beyond your comfort zone. And how does that happen? I think it comes through prayer and exposure. A burden follows exposure. And the more you involve yourself in various aspects of the community, the more you'll see the need. And the more you'll realize we can't be satisfied with what our church is doing. There are whole areas of town, or there are whole ethnicities that are not even being touched by the ministry of our church. We can't just say, well, we've got 100 people, 200 people, that's great. But you're reaching just a certain segment. Like an entire segment of the population has zero, possibility in a realistic sense. So the second thing I would say, you have to be intentional. This has to be a priority. You have to strategize. You have to plan. It doesn't just happen. You can't just say, everybody's welcome at our church. I don't know why they won't come. It's their problem. No, you have to go out of your way to be intentional. Now, I have some explanation here that I won't go into great detail, but we have to be convinced that the Great Commission is our responsibility locally as well as globally. So if I'm called to a certain area, and here's what I would say to our church many times, and this is part of being intentional. I know every single person in Austin can't be in our church. That's why we partner with other churches. That's why we have Daughterworks. But I want anybody that lives in this metro area, if they walked in our church, they would feel comfortable. They could think, I can belong here. One day I could see myself singing in the choir. One day I could see myself being on the church board. They need to feel that they could belong. I said, that's what I want to create. I don't want them to feel like, well, I have to go find another church that's more suited to my needs. And some will go to other places, fine. But I want them to feel like our church could be a viable option for anybody that lives in our area. So whatever we have to do to be welcoming, let's do what we can. And so part of that is we preach and teach that such as prejudice is a sin. It's not just bad. It's sinful. It's contrary to God's will. People that harbor hatred and prejudice in their heart aren't going to make it to heaven. So you start with the root of the problem. And it's not a matter of being politically correct. Sometimes you can be misunderstood, and certain people in the church will accuse you of trying to be politically correct. You say, it's nothing about that. It's being spiritually correct. It's being a holiness people. And of course, we have to treat people as individuals, not as stereotypes. And I find this well-meaning people who haven't had experience dealing with other races, they can flip to the opposite extreme in an attempt to overcome their prejudice or their previous lack of understanding. Many times it's not prejudice, it's just ignorance or lack of understanding of other people. But they can go overboard in trying to reference people of minorities. But it can come across in a patronizing way or an insensitive way or a stereotypical way, as if all people of a certain minority are going to respond a certain way. So I think one of the most important things we need to understand is we treat people as individuals. We don't treat them as races. Each individual is their own unique person with their own background. And even if our society lumps people in various racial categories, but there are tremendous differences within minority groups. So if you want to reach the Spanish-speaking community, you need to understand a Mexican and a Puerto Rican and a Cuban are completely different in their culture. And you want to say, oh, let's fix some food and put some jalapenos in it. Well, the Mexicans probably like that, but the Salvadorans or some other group may not like it any more than you might not like it. So you can't just play to stereotypes because there are differences within, in the same way within the black community. A Caribbean and someone from the Caribbean is going to have a very different experience. Someone from Africa is going to have a very different experience than someone who's African American or black raised in the U.S. So you can't just judge people or treat people according to stereotypes. You treat them as individuals. And there must be a realization that human nature is basically the same. Human problems are the same. So minister to human needs. Now, what I find in minority communities a lot more is that the needs are closer to the surface because, their higher percentage may live in poverty or in substandard conditions, and so the needs become more obvious. And also, sometimes they're more blunt about discussing their needs. But you basically have to realize, minister to people as individuals and recognizing everyone has needs and problems, and the gospel works in every culture. The gospel meets every need. So how can you be more effective, especially if you're trying to build a nucleus? Well, be respectful of different cultures and appreciative of different cultures. And recognize that different cultures are not necessarily better or worse, just different. Now, we do understand the Bible supersedes all cultures. So what the Bible teaches, that trumps any culture. But aside from that, and there are certain cultural characteristics that can be beneficial or detrimental. For instance, here in America, we place extreme emphasis on the individual initiative, individual rights, freedom of speech, work ethic. That's good to a point. That's helped us achieve and become the richest nation in the world. But being raised in Korea, Asian culture, and I would say also the first century Mediterranean culture of the Bible, is much more oriented toward the community, towards the family, respect for elders, respect for authority, working all together. A family might, if they're in poverty, they might all pool their resources and send one person to college of the whole family, and then that person is supposed to help all the rest of the family. They have this sense of family solidarity. There's much to commend that, because here in America, there's great disrespect for authority, discarding of elders, old people, And so I could see there's some ways American culture, I think, is better than Korean culture. And there's some ways I think Korean culture is better than American culture. But the bottom line, we don't stand in judgment upon cultures. Most of the time, cultures aren't better or worse, they're just different. And of course, if something is beyond our comfort zone, our initial reaction is unfavorable. So when you try new food you've never tasted before, often it can be unfavorable. You may later acquire a taste and even prefer it, but because it's outside your experience and your comfort zone, it seems distasteful. Same thing with musical styles. Same thing with just many ways of doing things. It strikes you as odd or weird or strange or dysfunctional. But if you step back, that's just because you were raised a certain way. Most of the time, it's not better or worse, just different. Every culture has its pluses and minuses. Now, this is important. Our goal is not to change people's culture or their politics. Our goal is to win them to Jesus Christ. So we're not trying to make them become like us. So if you're reaching to African Americans, what, 95% of them voted for President Obama. There's no point in trying to convince them to change their vote in order to be a member of your church. That's not what we're trying to do. Now, some of them may adopt more conservative values after coming to the Lord, or they may prioritize, actually, the African American community when it comes to traditional values can be very conservative, but they've been taught politically not to prioritize those things, but to prioritize other things. So after they come to church and become a disciple, they may change some of their priorities. They may change some of their thinking. But that's not really your goal. And so think about it. When it's a political time of the year, if statements you make from the pulpit, I think it's fine to say we support morality and, vote your conscience and vote for candidates who will uphold moral teaching and et cetera, but you got to be careful. Are you making statements from the pulpit that imply that in order to be a faithful member of this church, you got to vote a certain way? You got to belong to a certain political party. If so, that visitor that you're trying to reach or that new convert that you're trying to retain may not feel comfortable. Or even if they overlook it, they may not feel comfortable bringing their friends, knowing that their friends are going to be placed under some kind of obligation or pressure or feel like an outsider. So things that we take for granted, sometimes it's just a throwaway line for us because of our cultural background. It's obvious. But for someone coming from another background, that could signal, I don't belong here. I'm not welcome here. I will only be welcome, and I could only be a leader here if I drastically change something that I think is important to my identity. So we have to be sensitive to people to realize we're not trying to change their culture, their politics. We're not trying to make them like us. We're trying to evangelize and disciple them and then let God work in their lives. We have to build relationships. And this is true of all church planting and all church growth. It's based on relationships. We have to show love. We have to sincerely be interested in people. People can discern whether you care about them as a person or you just see them as a means to an end. You don't be something you're not. So when you're trying to make a connection with someone from a minority, you don't have to try to talk like them or use their terminology or imitate them. That will be seen as demeaning and inauthentic. Just be who you are. Be real. And give them the privilege to be the same way. They don't have to talk like you either. And sometimes you will face a misunderstanding or reverse prejudice, but you have to be patient. You have to be willing to work through that. Sometimes people have been discriminated against. Sometimes people have been oppressed. And maybe that's not so easy for a white person to understand. Well, instead of just writing that off, well, you should be more respectful to the police. You should be this, you should be that. I never had any problem. Why should you? You have to listen to what people are saying. And even if you feel like they've overly, adopted a victim mentality, again, you're not trying to reform them in every dimension. You're trying to win their soul. And once you win them, then they'll be able to reevaluate things in their life. So you can't get into political and social arguments about immigration policy or, you have to be willing to listen and listen to their point of view, listen to their experiences, and not argue, but invest time in them. Also, I think we have to be willing to train leaders. And I don't see it as affirmative action, but I see it as expanding our vision, thinking outside the box. This can happen in a local church. It can happen in a district where when you're using someone or you want to appoint someone or you want to involve someone, your mind just naturally goes to the people that you're closest to, that are most like you, and the first person in your mind. And it's not a conscious prejudice, but you step back and look and all your leaders fit a certain demographic. So what you have to do when you come to involve people and train people and make decisions, you intentionally think outside the box. and say, who all is available beyond who immediately comes to mind? And if someone's not quite qualified, could I invest in them to make them qualified? So it's not a matter of using an unqualified person as a token. It's a matter of being intentional to expand the pool. So we have to take extra efforts to pull in people. And this can be true of age, youth, young people. You know, the older you get, the younger the young people look, and they don't seem qualified. But, you know, I was full-time in ministry at age 24. My wife was 20. I was the dean of students at one of our Bible colleges. So I have to remind myself that 25-year-old kid could easily be in a very responsible leadership position. You know, we have to think outside our comfort zone and our experience. So that's with age, that's with male versus female, that's with racial and ethnic minorities. We just have to think about people who could be qualified, or even if they're not quite qualified, with time and investment, they could become qualified. And we must intentionally expand the pool of leadership. And from that, we will develop future leaders who can plant daughter churches or who can start effective outreaches. I say here that acquire knowledge. If you really want to be effective in reaching a minority group, you've got to study, you've got to learn. Do some reading. Sit down and talk to some. If you have someone in your church who's from that particular background, spend time talking to them. Ask them what they think would make your church more welcoming. I remember I told you I was struggling with the African American community because we had a few, but it was like maybe 5% or less. And you could see from the statistics that we ended up increasing to 17%, whereas in the community at large it was 10%. So we actually ended up becoming more effective in that demographic over time, but it didn't start that way. And I remember when we were struggling, it was really painful for me because we won a man and his wife who's African American. He was an adjunct professor at the University of Texas. He had his doctorate in engineering. He was a professional engineer. It's exactly the kind of person you could build on. And I wanted to use him as a teacher, but I was just letting him get established. Well, it turned out they loved our church. And I won't go through the whole story, but we helped them in several ways. My wife helped her with her newborn baby and all kinds of things. We ended up babysitting the child for a number of times while the mom was trying to struggle to get through, you know, postpartum issues and so forth. So we became very personally invested in that family. Well, this man's mother was a Democratic state senator from a northern state. She visited them, came to our church, and was appalled that he was not going to a historic African American church that was politically involved in the Democratic Party. So she read the riot act to him about you need to plug into an African American church. So he goes online and does research, and he finds in the 1920s the oneness movement split over racial issues. So he comes to me and says, I can't go to a racist church. I said, have you ever experienced racism here? He says, no. I said, you know, so I began talking about that. And he said, actually, this is the kind of church we'd love to raise our daughter in, a multiracial church. I said, well, why? Really? Because you're a racist church. I said, why am I a racist church? Because in the 1920s, there was a split in the oneness movement over race. I said, well, it was a lot more complicated than that. I can give you a book to read, and I explained some history to him. He said, I just can't do it. And I said, look, if you go to any other church in this place, in this whole city, and you research 100 years ago, you'll find the Baptists were split on race, the Methodists were split on race. You know, you go down the line, you go to charismatic churches and you track their history down. There's nobody who's exempt from the problems of our society of 50 and 100 years ago. But if you study the Pentecostals, they were founded as an interracial movement. And the oneness people worked together interracially longer and further than any other group, than even the Trinitarians. And we did have some problems and issues, but we are working to overcome those. And our church is the example. Nothing moved him. He was gone. That was painful. But you have to regroup. But over time, we had a few more of leadership material. And so I formed a committee, and I sat down and talked to them. What would make the church, what do you think would make the church more attractive? And so they gave me a list of suggestions. We started implementing them. One was a black gospel choir. And we decided it doesn't matter what color you are, if you can sing this style and you like this style, you can join the choir. But it's going to sing like once every month or two, and it's going to feature historic black gospel songs. Because they said there are a lot of people, black people, raised in church, and they have a very traditional idea of church. And this will just give them a level of comfort that every so often they're going to hear a song that just reminds them of their historic roots. And it communicates the church values, their heritage. Another thing they did, we were doing an international potluck for like an all-nation Sunday type thing. And that was very effective in getting minorities. And they said, you know what, let's do a soul food dinner. I said, you know, I would never do that as a white pastor because I would think that might be seen as, you know, patronizing. They said, no, trust us, let us do it. You're going to love it. And so I let them organize it. And of course, the whole church loved it. But they felt like they were being given an opportunity to serve and to highlight their culture. Again, I wouldn't have come up with that idea. I'd have been too scared to do it because of fear of being misunderstood. But I used them as the sounding board, and I use them to promote it. Now, I don't know if that will work in your church, but I'm just saying you can do intentional things. And once you get a few people who do share your vision, but who are part of that minority group, then they can coach you. You got to listen to them. If they say something is insensitive, don't argue with them about, no, it really isn't, and that's not what we mean. Trust them. They're the expert, okay? And so you adjust, and so you have to get past just the surface conversations to get to know people where they trust you and they feel like they can share their concerns or their impressions. And it does certainly help if people can see diversity in leadership. So find entry-level positions, and often a choir is a good way to do that. And my friend, Brother Terry, he points to the choir. He says the choir is often the most diverse part of a Pentecostal church, even when the other leadership is not diverse. He says, you know why? Because there's a defined path of leadership. Everyone knows what it takes to be in the choir. Everyone knows what the standards are for the choir. So you're communicating very clearly, this is open to everybody as long as you meet certain qualifications. He said, we need to do that for the rest of the church. We need to do that for the children's ministry and for the ushers, the hostesses. If you have clear guidelines and a clear path of how someone could become part, they know how they could qualify. It's not just up to somebody, recruiting them and calling them out and trying to involve them. They see a clear picture of how they could be involved, and that's how you will do this. Okay, let's see where we are. So if you want to plant a daughter church that focuses on a certain ethnic minority, or you want to increase the diversity of your local congregation, I think we were going to take an extra 5 minutes, so I think I have that extra 5 minutes right now. Okay, so how do you do that? You have to start preaching and teaching this to your church. You have to explain to your church why this is important. It's a biblical thing. And again, some people will think, oh, you're just being politically correct, or oh, you're catering to some minority, whatever. You have to share a vision from Scripture. You have to create an atmosphere that welcomes diversity. So, different styles of music. Now, this works in all ways. My preference, my personal musical preference is black gospel music or more contemporary music. I'm not a country western person at all. But in Austin, Texas, there's a certain segment of the population, country western is really important. So we included some country western special songs. And people loved it. And what I found, people that don't even like country and western, they see the sincerity of the people, the worship of the people, they got on board. Same with the black gospel. Some people weren't into the black gospel. They saw the sincerity of the worship, they got with it. And I found the whole church would get behind these various presentations. And so we would have a Spanish language song every once in a while. We would, and so what happens is when you do things like in your choice of music, in your choice of guest speakers, in your choice of leaders, even special food events, All Nation Sunday where you highlight diversity of dress, what happens is your main culture of your congregation can be more or less modern contemporary culture within a holiness context, of course. You don't have to flip the whole character of your church, but by including these elements from time to time, you are communicating people of different backgrounds are respected. And so while this church will never be a traditional black church or traditional Latino church, it will include elements where if you are black or Latino, you will find times where your culture is affirmed. And that's what you want. And that's what it takes for a multicultural church, is not that you swing from one extreme to the other, but it's that you include elements that make everyone feel like they belong and they're welcome. And that goes a long way. Special days such as All Nations Sunday, which is connected with United Nations Day. Martin Luther King Jr. birthday. You know, that's a national holiday. But don't we aspire some of the things that he preached, and he preached from the Bible quite a bit. Don't we aspire for that? So why can't we take advantage of that to say, on that Sunday, maybe to preach and use an illustration from Martin Luther King's life or ministry? Again, not as a tokenism, but as for the whole church. But drawing from more than our traditional resources, we can be more effective. Now, if you want to get started, you could start with a Bible study or a home friendship group or a Sunday school class that's focusing on another language or another or in a minority neighborhood. And you can try out these ideas in a small way. Now let me give you an example. Filipinos are everywhere. And Filipinos assimilate easily. Most of them know English very well because they have a diversity of languages in their own country. And so English becomes a common language even among them. So you probably, now we do have some great Filipino churches. But if you don't have a Filipino pastor or someone who has that ability, you don't have to necessarily start a Filipino church. But here's what I found. Since most of them know English well, they assimilate well into the mother church. But if you have a Sunday school class or fellowship or a Saturday service, maybe if it's just once a month, or a Sunday night service, then something that ministers to them and gives them fellowship, and they bring their food after the event, then they could be happy to be part of the main church as long as they have a special circle that highlights their own interest. And so that one service might be in their language, but everything else, they come to the main service. So there is a model of, if there's a significant group and their leaders, you might end up establishing a Daughterwork and a self-governing church. That would be fine. But that's not always necessary to be effective in reaching a minority group. They may just need a regular service or a Bible study or a social event that meets their social and ethnic needs, but if there's not a strong language barrier, the church can, as a whole, can minister to their needs. And you'll find that, for example, in the Hispanic community, some will prefer a Spanish language service or church. Some will prefer an English church. But even those that prefer English, having an occasional Spanish song, Spanish potluck, Spanish service affirms them. Because, no, they want to be part of the larger English-speaking church, but they want to be appreciated too. and there's something about your mother tongue, and there's something about the food you're raised with, it touches you emotionally. And so even though they're happy with the main church, but when you do something special that highlights their own culture, their language, their favorite style of food, it touches their heart and it bonds them to the church even more effectively. So there are many ways to do this, but you think in terms of, can I start a Bible study, a Sunday school class, a social event that will help attract people of a minority. And if you win one person of a minority group, since most of them value family a lot more than traditional, typical Americans, and since immigrant communities are often very connected to helping each other out, you have a gateway that maybe is greater than a typical middle-class white person. You win one person of that ethnicity, you could win a whole family, and you could win many people. You could reap a great harvest. So just as a practical matter, this could be one of the greatest keys to revival for your local church. But you have to invest in breaking that barrier. And then, if you do get a significant number of people from an ethnic community, consider what their special needs are. If they need to learn English, maybe you can start having classes at your church. English is a second language. Maybe there's some social services you can provide, some job training, some humanitarian assistance. And you'll be surprised. I'll close with this one illustration, but some years ago, our church, I was trying to get more involved in the community, trying to involve myself, and so we started supporting the refugee program with a small financial contributions. Well, I got a call one day and say, I have a group of refugees from Africa. They identify as Pentecostal. You're the only Pentecostal church in town that supports our efforts. Would you be willing to take them? The government will provide housing. The government will help them get jobs, but they need clothes, they need furniture, they need friends, they need computers for their kids to study. Would your church take them on as a project? I said, sure. Well, it turned out they were Trinitarian, but that's okay. In a few months' time, we had them baptized in Jesus' name. Or some of them, and some of them we found actually were Jesus' name. But I appointed someone to coordinate this. She sent out an email. Our church was overwhelmingly excited to get clothes and furniture. And I had people that wouldn't do anything and wouldn't contribute anything. All of a sudden were energized by that. And we ended up having a service of 40 people in the Kirundi language. I didn't even know there was a language called Kirundi. But God opened the door. So there are opportunities all around. Well, I've got to stop at this point, but would you like to split up in groups? Would you like to ask questions? Have I stimulated your thoughts here? We've got 10 or 15 minutes. Who would like to volunteer to say something or to ask a question or share an experience? Now's your opportunity. Yes, in the back.
Friend who is near a college campus, and so to teach English language to the foreign students, they started a Bible study, and they use the Bible study weekly to teach English language.
Outstanding. Yes, that's very effective. You know, college kids, they're away from home. They need help. They need English skills. They need friends. Many of them have never been into a typical American home. You invite them over for dinner. It's like an amazing experience for them. And you make friends. And typically these foreign students, I mean, they come from a wealthier class. They're going to go back and be doctors and lawyers and engineers and government officials. Some of them may end up staying here, but that can be a very effective tool of evangelism that could have repercussions far beyond what we see right now. Yes?
Bernard, did Austin ever do ESL, or are you aware of churches that do?
Yes, some churches. We never got strongly into that. We did provide other things, but yes, that is, and like he mentioned, whether a class for foreign students or just a class for immigrants. Yes, in the back.
In this room right here, it's the people from Burma that meet.
There you go.
It started from ESL.
Yes. Comment or question? You had your hand raised earlier.
I was just commenting about the
Yes.
We have really had an opportunity to expand that. We have 40 different people. We go through 5 different levels, and then at the end of the school year, we'll have the graduation ceremony, in which they can come in. We've taken them, from all their nationalities, they'll bring in their flag, and so it
Yes.
then have a lot of times, a lot of them are Hispanic and speak Spanish, so we'll bring in Spanish-speaking speaker and be able to have it that way, which has been really effective for us. And we tied into our Spanish service on the same day,
Yeah.
so they can have fellowship, because a lot of them are Latinos and speak.
Now, let me give you a couple things. Like I've mentioned All Nations Sunday, but you can have a program and a service. You can have people come dressed different ways. We did an international potluck, and here's what we did to our church. We said, we want you to invite someone of a different ethnicity or from another country, and you get to go to the dinner if you have brought someone. So if you haven't brought someone, you don't get to go to the dinner. That became a very exciting, and lots of times immigrants would love the invitation. They say, we're asking immigrants to come to our church service. They may not even be religious, but they're very honored to be asked to come to a special event and have dinner. Let me give you an example of Spanish. We started several out of our church. So what we did when we first won some people, you can get headphones. If you have one who can translate, they can sit in the back and translate, and people can listen to the service. That's an easy way to get started. Now, that isn't going to be sufficient because that's not the full experience. It's not the same. But it's a way to get started if you just have a handful. So if you grow a few more, what you do then, you have a service one Sunday a month, maybe Sunday night, whether if you don't have church on Sunday night, or even if you do, and if you have a fellowship hall or something. So then you do one Sunday a night. Well, that way they get their music, they get the full immersion. Of course, you have to have a preacher who can preach in Spanish, or at least an interpreter who can interpret. Well, then, if that builds, then you can go to every other week or every week. So it's just like what I was teaching yesterday about Daughterworks. You start with a simple outreach, and you let the demand tell you how it goes. So you don't have to start with a big splash, get a building, and spend a lot of money. You start with headphones. But you have to realize if it's successful, that's probably not going to be enough. So you go to the next level, and then as the demand, you just keep adding, and the Lord will give you leaders. And then when you do that, what we did, we would start a church, and then a couple years later, we're back in the same position because Spanish-speaking people are coming to our main service. And they don't want to go somewhere else where we have a Spanish church. They've got friends, or the family members, and so we start all over again with the headphones. And at any given time. So again, it's the both and, not the either or. Your main church can minister to people of other languages, but then you're also open to starting other works as the need becomes evident. Yes.
I just wanted to add, I'm Latin American, I have Spaniard, I have Mexico, and I have Indian in me, so I have it all. And not maybe all, but I can relate with what you're
Yes.
saying. The thing is that the more north that our people of those nations come to the north, they lose their
Traditional,
traditions.
right.
They lose their language because the elders are the ones that teach us. So when we come to, and my first language is English, so when I go back over there, it's like, you don't speak Spanish, so I have to kind of go both ways. But in the church, it's so beautiful. Everything that you've said is so wonderful because many of the elders have taught respect, and some of them are going to love you like mom and dad, and they're going to hug you and kiss you and love you, and so you have to be used to squishy, squashy, that mushy stuff, because we're really mushy people, okay? But and they love to give and they love to serve, and if they can trust you to the point where you'll love them unconditionally, okay? They're going to be so faithful to you. They're going to feel like, wow, I can tell you anything.
Yes.
I can break down and have a nervous breakdown, and you're going to help me to get straight. But and the food, a lot of times with food or the traditions, the
Right.
excited and they love to be up there. So everything that you have said is so wonderful, and it's so, it just wants to make you cry, because love, as Jesus said, is the greatest gift you can give. And if they are able to express to you, and you're able to embrace who they are, you got people for life.
Yes.
And they will serve you the greatest thing that they can give to you, because we're raised to believe you honor, God is number one. Pastor would be God here on earth. That's what they're going to tell you. Oh, you're the closest thing to Jesus I'm ever going to get. So if they see somebody offending you, or the first time I seen somebody throw hay at my pastor, I was like, oh my God, what'd you do? And pastor, he loved me, and he just said, no, it's okay, it's okay, I'm okay, But they're going to protect you, and it doesn't mean that they want to make trouble for you or go against whatever. It's just how they were taught. And so if they can love you, then you got it for life.
Right. Good. Yes, Brother Frank?
Bernard, I noticed that you had, several of your churches are independent.
Yes.
I remember my father-in-law was good friends with Brother Rooks. He said that Brother Rooks oftentimes had daughterwork churches, and it almost became routine for the church in Miami, where after they would get to a certain point, and he would
Yes.
turn them over to an autonomous church.
Right.
The church, the Daughterworks that you began in Austin, did you intend those all to become autonomous
Yes.
ultimately?
Yes. I think that's the proper model, because we're basically congregational in our own form of government. Somebody released you and me to be senior pastors. So I do feel like, and there is even a principle, authority equals responsibility. If you're going to have a pastor who's actually ministering to the needs of those people, at some point he needs to have the authority to do the job. So our goal is just like raising kids to become adults. The goal was for those churches to become self-governing in their own right, still closely connected by ties of love and fellowship and doctrine. My requirement was they needed to be affiliated with the UPCI, and if they would do that, then I would release them. But that was my goal. Now, having said that, some things are just outreaches. And so, for example, we had a Filipino outreach. As I explained before, they didn't really want to be a separate church. They didn't really have a pastor. They wanted the English. In many cases, they were married to English-speaking people, and their kids were preferred English, or English was their first language. But they still wanted that fellowship. So we would have a Filipino fellowship. So that was never intended to be a self-governing work. But the ones that we started as Daughterworks, and particularly in our area, you have a lot of first-generation Spanish and still coming. So there's the ongoing need for the language. It's not just a historic language. It's, and so, yes, the goal there, if you can get full leadership, it's just like overseas, self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating. When they would reach that level, then we release them.
Would you take 2 minutes
Okay?
and talk to the issue of when and how is it appropriate to start a daughterwork?
Okay. Well, I did go through that last time, yesterday, and I can spend maybe even a little more time this afternoon because I want to talk about some of the policy. But it's need-based. What my simple 2-minute answer would be, you start with outreach, which every church should be doing in some form. But when you tap into an ethnic minority or to an area of town that's underreached or to a neighboring town, and a rule of thumb might be if people are having to commute more than 15 or 20 minutes, you're going to have a hard time getting non-church people to make that commute. So if you get a toehold in one of those categories, you think in terms, could this be an opportunity? So you start with a Bible study and you win a few people and it might terminate. But if there's a group that wants to keep it alive, you transition to a home friendship group or an ongoing Bible study. Yes. So this is my answer. You start with outreach. You start with a Bible study. If that's all it is, you win a soul, end of Bible study. Start another one somewhere else. But if the people, they want another Bible study, they're bringing their friends, they're bringing their family. They're not really wanting to travel every service or all the events. They're wanting to keep something. So then you make it like a home friendship group or a cell group. But then some of those people will say, well, this is my church. Why can't we have a service? Well, then you start Saturday night, Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, Sunday night, whichever works, and you find a location. Might be a home, might be a school, and it might be a storefront, might be another church that will let you use their facility at low cost. And then you start a preaching point. So what a preaching point is, you're actually having a service as opposed to a Bible study. But you're not saying it's going to ever become more. It's still an outreach. But then, if that takes a character of its own, and you can identify a leader who was willing to establish it, then that becomes a daughter work. And when you say daughter work, in my opinion, and UP say our policy, you're stating our intention is one day it will become a self-governing church. Now, it may take years, it may never happen, but we're setting up an expectation that eventually we want this to become self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating. UPCI. Right. Okay. All right, we're out of time, so I got to quit. We'll have one more session about this afternoon.